What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is David Ramsden-Wood here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And today I thought we would take a step back, as you know I like to do, when we can talk energy broadly, but in a different context. And so I'm joined by Michael Lynch, who is I don't know ever how to, analyst, reporter, journalist, thought leader. How are we going to describe you today, Michael?
I think analysts. I do blog for Forbes.com, but I've been writing and researching for over 4 decades now.
And so I enjoy reading Michael's work, as others know. Ellen Wald with Wald Wednesday does some work. David Blackman and I chat. And so obviously Forbes is a big distribution of writers and thought. And so, Michael, let's talk, maybe just jumping right in to some of your recent articles you've been writing on. And I don't know if I want to start with Yellen and the Federal Reserve, or if I want to start with EVs and subsidies, but they're kind of related, right? So talk to me about your take on EVs and where we're going with that today.
Well, we've actually been doing some work. I work with EPRINC in Washington, and we've been doing some work on that. And, the thing is, I'm extremely skeptical about the market for EVs at the current time. I found all these wonderful quotes about how, they're going to take over the day after tomorrow, as they say. Of course, some of those quotes are from the 1990s. I have a book here, Power Surge. Let's see.
Oh, with the green screen. There you go, right in front of you. Power Surge. Okay.
From 1994, the end of the gasoline car has come. To reduce greenhouse gas emissions with electric vehicles is about the most expensive way you can go about it, short of hiring lawyers to run in giant hamster wheels. It's 10 to 15 to 20 times is more expensive than all the other things being proposed. And it's just kind of silly. There was a wonderful Forbes column by a woman who owns a Tesla 3 who talked about how it turned her vacation into a disaster because she spent so much time trying to find charging and arranging it. And, it's just, the electric car is the answer to we want electric cars, not anything else. And it just makes me crazy to see all the misinformation out there about them.
So let's talk about misinformation, because I do think that's great. And I had written a blog in February when some friends, a hockey teammate of my son's, drove from Denver to Omaha, and it was during the polar vortex. It was 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and their battery life went down half. And the heater, because it wasn't using like excess heat from the combustion engine, the heater was a switch, and the switch broke. So in fact, inside the car was like 15 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 hours in the middle of nowhere, while their battery life was 100 miles, and they almost had to abandon it. Now, of course, this is one of those like user exception stories, but as you said, we don't hear a lot about that. So that pivots us, I guess, and we'll come back to EVs, but narrative. It really feels like there's a narrative and that there's themes, and I won't have you comment about your particular distribution channels, but we can call it Bloomberg. I found it funny that during the polar vortex, a day after, there's an article that comes out about how it's not wind's fault, it's fossil fuels' fault. And somehow everyone suspends the reality that the owner of Bloomberg is a $50 billion man who ran for president of the United States on an anti-fossil fuel platform. And then miraculously, his distribution said the wind wasn't to blame, when clearly it was part of the problem, as was a whole bunch of other things. How do you manage narrative, and what happens to our world when so many people are so influenced by the 2-paragraph titles, the scan through Twitter, the push of the media to believe a certain thing that may or may not be true?
Well, this is something I've been wrestling with and with colleagues. And, when people suggest things like, oh, let's go ban fossil fuels completely, and you kind of say, that's just really crazy. Or, electric cars, we need to have electric cars for the poor. Well, they're very expensive. So, they're not for the poor. I like to feel that, you really just have to try to engage people with the debate, to do in-depth looks at facts and get away from the cliches, which, it makes me crazy so many times when I appear on a cable news show or something, and they sort of they want two people kind of like, you may not remember, probably too young to remember the old SNL bit, point counterpoint, where they just insult each other. And you don't actually discuss the real facts. So, with peak oil, people would say things like, oh, oil is finite. And you try to explain to them, no, actually, oil is renewable. It's solar energy converted by plant and microbial matter into, and then geochemical processes into fossil fuels. It's so in that sense, it's wrong. And yet I would have geologists say that to me. I'm not, it's really hard when, somebody was talking about, you'll forgive me for name dropping, I guess, Yoko Ono and a busload of people fighting fracking. And you read this stuff and you sort of go, you realize everything you're saying is wrong. And the point is, they just kind of wave their hands and go, well, who are you? I'm famous. So I try with my work to give very good details, to not make superficial arguments, to kind of, go into the real numbers. So for example, I've heard lots of anecdotes about people with electric cars. Well, I went to the Tesla website and they said, okay, you put in the speed and it'll tell you the range of the car, and you put in the temperature and it will tell you the range. So I can say, okay, here's the change in the range according to Tesla. Here's a table with the numbers. I've done that. So I think, as much as the public discussion is dominated by he said, she said arguments, I think it's valuable to always have a backup where you can say, here's some real data, here's references, this is academic quality work, shall we say, as opposed to just, somebody from Hollywood standing up and waving their hand saying, Tom Hanks loved his GM EV1, as, went on The Tonight Show saying how great it was. Time magazine listed it as one of the 50 worst cars of all time. So, I'm not always successful, I have to admit, in winning arguments, but I think at least you have to try.
So let's talk on the EVs. When you talk about how expensive it is, can you put some numbers in context too? I mean, I think I saw coming out of the Biden stimulus plan or the infrastructure plan, there's north of $400 billion of sort of additional tax credits, with the goal that the US wouldn't sell combustion engine cars by 2040. The huge change by 2030. And I look at it and I think about the limitations on mining, the limitations on battery life, the limitations on, quite frankly, is it worth $100,000 to go buy a Tesla? So who's buying these cars, and then what? But so let's put some numbers maybe to this topic. What say you?
Okay. There are very few cars that come in both conventional and electric modes. So you can't compare a Tesla Model 3 with, a Toyota Camry. However, when you do look at cars like the Ford Focus, I think it was the Focus was in both kinds, the Hyundai Kona, and others, you find that the difference in cost in the price being charged tends to be at least $10,000 and often $15,000. And all you're really doing is cutting your emissions by something like a third to one half, depending on where you're getting the electricity. So that's a lot of money. The government gives $7,500 in subsidies to buyers of electric cars, or tax break. A lot of state governments will give you $2,000 or $3,000. I think California is still $2,500. I don't know any other major product where people are paid so much money to buy it, and yet you have people saying, "Oh, this is a wonderful product." It's like, well, if it's wonderful, why don't have mandates? Don't have subsidies?
It is the tax credits again. It's just there's so much interesting here, and I use California as an example. Obviously, they're the pioneer of sort of renewables and planet impact. And what's interesting to me is their average energy consumption is something like 60% less than the rest of the country because most of the state lives in incredibly temperate weather. And so to compare Minnesota to California, literally you couldn't survive a winter with those choices. And as we saw with the polar vortex, if you have a continuation of an expansion of more renewables,
Yes.
you're going to end up with the intermittence. And so as we saw in Texas, just the cold in Texas drew so much natural gas, the prices went up so much around the country that I think about California in the next blackout, if there's a heat wave elsewhere and that energy is not being diverted from Arizona into California, but they themselves keep the energy. I mean, it seems to me like we're truly gearing up for a massive energy crisis in the United States because we're not valuing overall energy product. We're valuing specific energy product. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the having studied political economy for a while, one of the things that I found fascinating was the debate over industrial policy, and the people who tend to say, if only the government went in and told companies you should be doing this, then we'd be so much better off. And you find that tends not to hold up. I recall the Clinton administration's partnership for a new generation vehicle, which was supposed to bring out a supercar. That was 25 years ago. It never appeared, obviously. The thing is that energy policy is often driven by people who have a fairly superficial knowledge of the energy system, of energy engineering, or energy economics. And so they tend to make mistakes as you see, as you mentioned, in Texas. Well, it didn't occur to them that they'd have a really cold day and the natural gas would be used to heat, and so not as available for power production. And that at the same time, wind turbines would freeze, and there would be cloudy. The solar panels wouldn't work. We've already seen that happen, though, a number of times. I was amused to see that England had to ramp up its coal plants because they had an extended cloudy period. And you sort of say, wow, the English people didn't think they'd have lots of clouds? So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I mean, but again, it's sort of interesting because you have to put all this in the backdrop of politicians. And
Yes.
and I don't want to sound so tinfoil hatty, but it's like when I had talked about when we first sold One Energy and I had started doing this, I said, I want to run for governor of Colorado, not because I think I can win such a blue state, but because I feel like the dialogue and the topics that we're talking about, we're pushing all these narratives that I think need more rigorous debate. And I talked to a political consultant. They said, well, if you start with $2 million of your own money, that would be a really good investment that would show other people that you're serious about this. And it's probably 10 to 12 million to run for governor. And so I was like, okay, wow, back that up. So you want me to take $2 million of my money at a very high risk thing that I am likely going to lose and put that into a political campaign. My expectation, if I were investing that money in the market at that risk profile, is I would want a 10x or a 20x, right? To take that money at that risk profile to make it worthwhile. And so then when I think through that, of course, I'm going to be beholden to those that give me money because it's the only way I can get a return. And if that's truly the way politics works, that the money in there, and same with distribution of magazines and newspapers, they sell ads to companies that are selling products that want to push a narrative that their product is the best, and on it goes. I'm curious, is there a less cynical way for me to look at that?
I'll recommend there's the famous political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History, that was much criticized. He also has a book on political decay, and he talks about how governments sometimes fall into this habit of not the politicians, instead of saying, I'm going to try to make things better for everybody, they say, I'm going to try to bring the goods home to you. So you get politicians, and you mentioned money from companies. Well, it's also jobs. People want to go back and say, oh, I helped out this company because they have 400 jobs. So it's on both sides of the equation, and it is a hard problem to deal with, because in the end, and I, when I was an undergraduate, we had Mark Shields, who recently retired from PBS NewsHour as a commentator, and he came to our class and he said, if you want to be a politician, people think, oh, you have to go out and shake hands for hours on end. He says, no, you have to sit down with some rich guy who says, I want to put underwear on dogs. And you go, yeah, we'll look into that. Write a check. And, this is a problem, but I don't know. I'm not completely sold on the idea that, oh, you could just tell everybody don't take donations. You're going to be beholden to people some way or another if you're a politician, whether it's voters, workers, unions, big companies, rich people, or whatever. I think transparency is the first thing you can do. But as you probably run into, when you take a stance, your opponents will often say, aha, that's because you're getting money from the oil industry. And I've been accused of that many times, which frankly is largely untrue. I get a lot more money from governments and banks for analysis than I do from the oil industry. I do get a little money from natural gas production in West Virginia. My granddad started drilling over 120 years ago up in West Virginia. Sadly, one of his colleagues, a guy named Peter Guffey, went to a place called Spindletop and drilled a well there and found the first gusher. My granddad, he stayed in West Virginia. So, unfortunately, Guffey became rich and moderately famous, at least in the oil business. My granddad, nobody remembers him.
Well, it's funny that you talk about sort of Spindletop and the timing of that, because like I really feel like the argument around, and let's look at EVs. It's less about green climate change, and we can have a debate about climate change, and perhaps we will. But to me, it's about scarcity. And so, like, there are scarce materials on Earth. We have 7.8 billion people on the planet, and we're trying to spread those out in the most long dated way we possibly can. But at the end of the day, something like you're going to run out of stuff. And so if the argument was, at this pace of consuming oil, we're 70 years away from not having any more oil, and therefore we need to pivot to something else, and such and such, or we pushed efficiency metrics, or like, to me, the hybrid car is actually quite an interesting concept where you have, you get much more mileage for what you do. So you're using less of the battery, you get the convenience of the combustion engine. Like, there seems like there's better solutions than the ones we just blaze down. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, actually, I just gave a talk yesterday to people in the government, and one of my slides compared the electric vehicle and the hybrid. And I said the hybrid gives you almost as much reduction in greenhouse gas savings for something like 20% of the cost. And it doesn't have any of the drawbacks of the electric car. You still have the range. You can fill it up in 3 or 4 minutes. And unfortunately, people are not buying them because, with gasoline at $2.50, it's not that cost effective. I mean, in Europe, they're a lot more cost effective. But it is kind of the thing, if you ever watch the documentary, I'll call it a doc. It's called a documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car? They make out like, oh, this was so wonderful, and people would only buy them if you advertise them with models in evening gowns, and that's pretty much nonsense. But the great thing was they had the regulator who said, look, it's not my job to make people buy electric cars, it's my job to clean up the air. And when you say, what is the most cost-effective way to go about this? Well, hybrid cars are a lot more cost-effective than electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are only promoted by people who want electric vehicles, not because they think it's the best solution. And this is, again, it's kind of the superficial approach to things where somebody comes up with some, general answer like, oh, let's all go electric. And they don't think about, where you're going to get the electricity, where you're going to get the minerals. But more importantly, and I'm one of the people who's argued for years that people's perception of resources tend to be way too conservative. They don't realize just how abundant most of these resources are, including oil. But money is scarce. I mean, you can print money, so in that sense, it's it's infinite. But right now, although the government has borrowed a lot of money, and somebody's going to have to pay for that at some point. But if you say, well, the IEA says, okay, we need to spend something like $30 billion a year to add infrastructure for electric cars to help us go to electric cars. More generally, $1 trillion a year in investment to switch from sort of the business as usual to a cleaner, sustainable future. That's a lot of money. And I'm always reminded of the anti-nuclear advocate who was told, oh, if we close all the nuclear plants, it would cost $400 billion. And he said, I'd pay for that. And of course, what he meant was, I'm willing to let somebody else pay for that.
Right. It is interesting that we don't really boil things down to debate, right? Because we talk about this sustainable future. Okay. But it's like batteries, like we're already talking about recycling batteries because they don't last forever. We know that wind turbines don't last more than 20 years because of erosion and a whole bunch of other issues. Solar panels, they don't always work because it's not always sunny. As you said, it can be cloudy some days. And again, those have a life. So we're using resources and materials to build the things which we then can't really recycle. So we're using sustainable in a very convenient way to me. And then this is it's a little bit off topic, but this one's been driving me crazy since last week's episode when I interviewed Jill Evanco, who's the CEO of Chart Industries. And we talked about hydrogen. 95% of hydrogen in the world is made from methane. And it takes a huge amount of energy to break up the methane. You're still releasing the carbon molecule in that particular case. And then you're making water as the byproduct. And water is itself 3 to 8 times more of a greenhouse gas than is CO2 when in the air as a water vapor. And so the other people would say, okay, well, CO2, because of the CO2, it's warming, so more water gets absorbed from the oceans into the air. That's the problem if we reduce CO2. But if we're making cars out of hydrogen energy, they're literally making water vapor, which is not, that is the heating consequence. And I don't understand, if we really care, why we're even investigating hydrogen. It's illogical to me.
I agree. And I've known people, I was at MIT for many years, and I knew somebody once came to me and said, they just did a study, the future of the automobile, and their big conclusion was we should all switch to methanol. And I said, oh, that was Jack. And he says, how did you know? I said, that's his research for the last 30 years. So that's his answer to everything.
Right.
That's
I've been doing this for 30 years. It turns out, no, I don't like it. I think we should just do what we've been doing. I can't make any money off it. There's no speaking tours, but we've done a pretty good job, everyone. Just carry on.
Yeah. So, hydrogen in theory sounds like it could be wonderful if you ignore things like the economics, especially, and you're going to a huge amount of effort to do a small reduction in emissions. And I keep saying, God, people are burning coal, huge amounts of coal in Asia. They're still building coal-fired power plants. If you switch to natural gas, not only would it not cost much money, it might save you money depending on the pricing, but you could do it a lot quicker, and that would have a big impact sooner. And again, much more cost effective than saying, oh, can we switch these pipelines to hydrogen power? Maybe someday in the long-term future, you'll have hydrogen. But I think our experience is when you say, okay, we need to get this technology ready because we'll need it in 20 years. You find 20 years later, no, you have other technologies that came along. And usually it's because, clever people somewhere did the research, as opposed to some politician said, I think we should have this because it sounds good. Or I once testified in Congress, 1996, there were people in the Department of Energy saying, you know, all the oil is in the Middle East, so we need renewables. And I said, well, there's lots of oil everywhere, so that's not as important. All of the Congress people were saying, but you know, there's 40 jobs in my district from this electric bus, you know, project and so forth. And at the end, I said, when they asked me to make a comment, I said, you know, the problem is you people are steering money not into the best research, but into the research projects in your own district. And they all laughed and nodded, and I was never invited back.
Well, I mean, and again, these are the conversations that are so obvious. Yes, it's about getting reelected. It's about jobs in your district. It's not about the efficient allocation of resources. It's, yes, you know, pick your topic. So you had mentioned the debt, and at some point in the future, we're going to have to pay for it. And yet in my lifetime, I've never really seen balanced budgets. I see the debt. I remember when I was in New York in about 90, let's say 89, I was there with my parents, and I remember seeing the debt clock for the first time. And my recollection was it was about $8 trillion, which seemed just astronomical. And so this is, you know, going back 30 years, but we're now at 28, 29 trillion with no end in sight in the deficits. We've started talking about tax plan changes, et cetera. What do you make of this, and how does this whole spend and spend end well? How is that possible?
I think it's possible. I have some serious concerns because, frankly, politicians are not always the most capable at making these decisions. I think what we really need is better economic growth, long-term, sustainable economic growth, which doesn't mean, you know, renewable energy. It means that economic growth that powers itself as opposed to runs off of the Federal Reserve's checkbook. So I am concerned. We did in the 90s, we did have balanced budgets, I think, a couple of years. And it was, I think, more a question of people saying we have to do something. Let's try to get spending and taxes closer to being in balance. And then fortunately, you had the internet bubble, which meant a lot of people paid taxes on their capital gains. Maybe next year we'll see the deficit go down from the current stock market gains. But it also comes down to, it's not a question of, you know, spending the money. It's a question of wasting the money. If you say, okay, again, you know, we're gonna build giant hamster wheels and have people running them because that's jobs. You say, no, that's stupid. And if you say, okay, we're going to tell all those petroleum engineers who make $100,000 a year that they're going to start putting solar panels on roofs for $35,000 a year, and say, see, we have jobs. That's the kind of thinking we need to avoid. Economic efficiency matters. And again, to sort of say, you know, money is a resource that shouldn't be wasted. But unfortunately, people who are spending other people's money are all too quick to throw it at things. And that's an old complaint from when I was a boy. The Republicans complained about Democrats doing that, but Republicans in recent years have done that a few times themselves.
Well, it is truly amazing. I saw an article about 3 weeks ago now, that California, in spite of everything, expects that they're going to have a $19 billion surplus this year, having shut down all their businesses because the gains in Silicon Valley tech companies, IPOs, SPACs, craziness, the capital gains that were executed during 2020 on that actually offset all of the business income that was made by the entire state. And that they're now having to refund, because there's a law that if they ever have like a surplus, they distribute it to Californians, which is truly shocking to show the disconnect between the market and the mainstream. Now, you and I, before we jumped on, we're talking about, you had just said you got your vaccine. And I'm curious because a whole bunch of this trade is the roaring 2022s, that everyone's been pent up. Everyone has all this demand. Everyone has all these savings, and off we go. What's your take from how your life was different over the last year versus how it might be different with the vaccine, And do you buy into this roaring 2022's narrative?
Well, I've been working at home for years, but I certainly miss the opportunity to travel. Especially, I usually come every year to Colorado to a conference in Boulder, which I miss greatly. Um, the biggest change is my wife is in the house all the time teaching online, so this means I can't snack quite as much as I used to, which is too bad. But people one of the things I try to talk about is don't confuse the short term unusual events with the long term. And you might remember 98, the oil price collapsed, and a lot of people said, it's going to stay low forever. That was the famous cover on The Economist, drowning in oil. It's like, no, it's a price war in OPEC. Okay. That's, the price was low and then it collapsed. It'll go back up. We don't know what post-pandemic life is going to be. I don't think it's going to be that different. I do think there's some pent-up demand. People have a lot of savings because the government's giving out money, and people can't spend it as readily as they used to. But I worry that you have a quick surge, and that looks like the new normal, and then you get some pullback. I don't think people are going to stop driving or traveling. As much as I love being on Zoom with you, David, it's not the same as, having you buy me a steak dinner and beer. What's the Colorado beer? The beer in Boulder.
Odell's.
Oh no, I forget. There's some local beer that I always have when I'm out there. But anyway, human nature hasn't changed. Now, yesterday I was talking about this and to somebody in the government, and I put up a picture of Zhou Enlai, the Chinese communist leader, and I said, someone asked him, what's the impact of the French Revolution in 1789? And he said, it's too soon to say. And I said, I really suspect that 5 years from now, we're going to look back and say, boy, that was terrible, but everything's back to normal. So, again, there's going to be a lot of debt to pay off. I think, people will get capital gains and pay taxes on that. But, when the stock market comes back down, which I think it will, they'll have capital losses and they'll write that off. And that could cause states like California a big problem because, the federal government will just go, oops, okay, we have more debt, but the states usually are not allowed to hold debt. So they may have to raise taxes and fire people and do all kinds of things.
That's been the one. Well, there's been so many disappointments. I made sort of a jokey post on LinkedIn yesterday that I've had to take a step back from writing because it's been so frustrating. For example, that these small businesses were forced to shut down for various reasons, and we can debate the merits. And if masks work, then why weren't businesses open? And if businesses needed to be closed, then why were you can just go cyclically. But government really didn't reduce the salaries. They didn't furlough people, really. They didn't address the teachers and say, well, hey, now we could probably teach all, since you guys aren't doing a great job on Zoom anyway, instead of the teacher-student ratio being 30-1, we could easily do 90-1 because we're just doing videos. And in fact, we could probably have all of grade 4 taught by the best grade 4 teacher in America and just film that teacher, and then the rest of them could be furloughed because we now have an imbalance. And so we're all in this together. So presumably the teachers should lose their jobs, and the doctors should lose their jobs, and the police should lose their jobs, other than the defund the police movement. And so the intellectual inconsistency around the way the winners and losers were picked, and that, I make this joke that a sex toy shop is probably the most socially distant store pre-pandemic than anywhere. Because I don't want to stand anywhere near the creep in front of me, even though he's buying exactly the same thing as me. I'm looking down at my shoes. I'm not breathing on anyone. I'm wearing as much protection to guard my identity as humanly possible. And yet that store was closed during the pandemic while I could buy the exact same product on Amazon that took a guy in the warehouse to go get it and move it and ship it, and carbon footprints and stuff. And it's so intellectually inconsistent and dishonest that it's hard. So you write about this stuff. You see topics, you talk to colleagues, very well educated. I mean, how do you not drive yourself crazy with some of the things you write about?
Um, it is very hard. And frankly, I live in one of the most liberal parts of the country, Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'll get people talking to me about saving energy, and I'll say, go stand on the street corner and look at all the SUVs go by. I joke that people are environmentally conscious if they put a Greenpeace bumper sticker on their SUV. Um, I have to get a picture. I haven't done it yet, but in the summer, the local, we'll say upscale grocery store sometimes has a display with a sign that says these carrots were delivered by bicycle from a local farm. But 10 feet away, they have a stack of cases of mineral water imported from Italy.
Right.
And, I grew up drinking from a hose. I still drink water from the tap. The idea of spending $1 for a bottle of water makes me crazy. But people do it. And it's, when you try to say to somebody, well, famously, Leonardo DiCaprio made a documentary called The 11th Hour, and he said, we need to live simply. Have you seen his mansion?
Yeah, and his yacht and his airplane. I mean,
and his airplane. And
yeah.
So and part of it is trying to get people to think. I mean, I'd like to think there was some great golden age when people sat around and really thought about things instead of throwing tomatoes at their debate opponents. But I've been in many debates where people I would say, well, this is wrong. Here's the data. And they would say, well, let's talk about something else.
There's a wonderful Woody Allen movie called Midnight in Paris that stars Owen Wilson, of all people, who you would not expect to be in a movie that you would, I mean, other than Armageddon, you're obviously going to watch that every single time it's on, and Wedding Crashers. But Midnight in Paris, the concept was he went into a bar and he went back to the 50s, I believe. And the 50s were, in his mind, the golden age when things were simpler and better. And the people he met in the 50s then were able to go back to like the 1900s, which was the golden age. And then they went back into a bar and they went to the 1850s or however it worked. But generally the concept was it always used to be better. And now we're fighting problems we've never fought before, which, I didn't live through the late 60s and 70s, but when I see the television and really like the social unrest that arguably was deserved at that time versus some of this stuff that we get all up in arms about today, it really feels like that was a more difficult time than now. You had some time in that era. How do you compare the two?
Yeah, I actually wound up a couple of years ago sitting on a bus next to a young black man. I was going down to New York, and I don't like driving to the city. And we were saying, I said, yeah, boy, things are so much better than they used to be racially. I mean, there's still problems, but yeah, not like the 60s. My favorite was always the movie Atlantic City with Burt Lancaster as the aging mobster, retired mobster. And he's telling the young woman, oh, this city used to be great. And even the Atlantic Ocean, in those days, it was an ocean. Homer in the Iliad kept saying, oh, people today, they're not tough like they used to be. So
Right.
People always say that. It's selective memory, but it's also the same when people will say, I found one big study on, we're all from a group that says oil companies are all going to be worthless. Their stocks are going to be worthless because we're all switching away. And 4 years ago, they said, well, we found that Volkswagen says they're going to sell an electric car for the same cost as the Golf. And they said by 2020. Well, the car's out now. It costs twice as much as the Golf. But they found a quote. And trying to tell people, you need to know more than just a quote or a datum or being able to cite a website on the internet, which people think they do. There's an excellent book called The Death of Expertise by a guy named Tom Nichols.
Okay, and Death of Expertise. I like that.
Yes. And he says, so many people think, oh, I read something or I heard something. He says, yeah, okay, somebody who drank prune juice and their cancer was cured. So you're not going to listen to it. But don't you think the odds are that you should listen to a doctor?
Yeah, it is interesting, and Twitter and social media certainly have added to that because again, and with anonymous accounts, but even without anonymous accounts, I mean, I would make the case that Bill Gates, was an extraordinarily successful entrepreneur in the computing industry and became worth one of the most richest, the wealthiest people in the world. Is his pandemic expertise, on par with someone? Maybe, maybe not. But it's interesting because, as you said, in the tomato throwing, some people will say, well, you don't have the expertise, you can't comment, but then this other person can, when really it just comes down to money and platform. The larger the platform, i.e. a distribution, a magazine, the New York Times, etc., or, quite frankly, in the broader sense, Twitter or Facebook can censor and pick which articles they show more frequently, who they tune down. I mean, they can just mess with these knobs and create any narrative they want. The death of expertise is because you don't even know who's an expert anymore, and there's no fair and balanced reporting of that. Fair?
Yes. In my book, I open with a story about James Schlesinger, who was the first Secretary of Energy. He was also at one point head of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. And he said, peak oil, this was in 2005, we now realize peak oil is real, it's here. And I pointed out that in 1979, he said the same thing, peak oil, this is the peak of oil. But I also pointed out that even though he was a PhD economist, he never worked in energy. So he sounds like an expert, and he was tall and very distinguished looking, but he was not really knowledgeable. And I wrote one article called "How Two Nobel Prize-Winning Economists Got Oil Wrong," and I said, these I think they're very smart economists. I had a class from one of them, but he was not a resource economist. And he came up with a theory 50 years ago that, the price of minerals have to rise exponentially over time. It can be proved mathematically. And his colleague, Maury Edelman, who was my mentor, who was a resource economist, spent 3 decades saying, you're doing the math wrong. Plus, mineral prices never rise exponentially. If you adjust for inflation, they're basically flat for 150 years, as long as we have data. And yet he could never convince the guy. And people... Again, somebody will find that article he wrote back in 1973 and say, oh, look, you can prove mathematically the price of oil should be $200 in 20 years or something like that. It is a problem. And this is where I think it helps to have a good debate. I often tell people, here I am, the expert, saying, don't trust the experts. Well, you don't know who I am. I actually have in my book, I got down from the internet, somebody put in a bunch of my bad price predictions. I said, yeah, here they are. These are all short-term predictions of prices. Here's a list of all my major research publications and how well they worked out. And, mostly not too bad, but some I got wrong, certainly. It's astonishing the number of people who are convinced they're experts. And I saw someone, I won't mention his name, once said, oh, I know more about energy than anybody in this country. And I said, yeah, unfortunately, most of it is wrong, which goes back to the 19th century, an old joke. It's not what he doesn't know that bothers me. It's what he does know that isn't so.
Right.
And one more anecdote. I was at 25 years ago, a big Harvard MIT conference on energy and the world economy. And they had an oil panel, and the oil people all said, there's plenty of oil, don't worry about it. And somebody said, well, yesterday, the automotive engineers, the researchers said, we can make the car much more efficient and much cleaner. But at dinner last night, we had an official from the Department of Energy, the Clinton administration, tell us we have to use electric cars because we're running out of oil and we can't make the cars any cleaner. He said, what's wrong with this? And somebody said, you'll notice that the person who gave that speech came in, spoke, and left, didn't attend any of these sessions. I've been many conferences where a politician will give a speech and immediately leave. I've been once, I sat where the Secretary General of OPEC actually went to some of the research sessions. That was partly because it was Bali. There wasn't many places for him to go. So, but
well, I think that's actually a great call to action out of this is you're right. A lot of people, they get invited to speak and they're the so-called expert, and maybe they're not consuming enough data, and they're not reflecting on perhaps where they were wrong. One of the most concerning public figures, at least to me in that regard, is Anthony Fauci. where he seems to continue to double down with this fear and lockdown and, oh, it's right around the corner. And so it seems to me like we've ignored that in the last 16 days since Texas put their mask mandate on, their case count has done exactly what everyone else's case count has done, which is it's gone down. And you can compare Florida to California and the different approaches. You can compare South Dakota to, I mean, pick your place. The data is showing a thing, and it seems like officials are more interested in pushing the narrative and fear than they are of like recalibrating and rebuilding credibility, being like, okay, we're, everyone who's vulnerable is vaccinated, like we're good. On we go. What do you think about that?
Well, my impression is masks work pretty well. People should wear masks in enclosed places, especially. Dr. Fauci, he knows more about medicine and epidemiology than I do, but his job is not the well-being of the country. It's the health of the citizens, not the economy. And this is why you wouldn't put him in charge of everything. He advises, he doesn't make the decisions. I do not know where we're going to go with, the lockdowns and so forth. I suspect strongly that they were overdone in a bunch of places. But it makes me crazy to see, people going to parties, getting drunk, or bars, drinking and frankly, singing and talking loud. I always talk louder when I'm drinking. Don't tell anybody. Not that it's a secret.
I think we're all in the same boat.
Yeah. So, this is always a problem. It's just like there's a guy in Colorado who proposes energy efficiency, and he doesn't think about the cost. All he cares about is, can you make a more efficient car? And at one point, 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, he was saying, I can build a car that gets 100 miles per gallon. It only costs like $120,000. It's like, why would we do that?
Which A, never got built, and B, I mean, it's very interesting. So then I'll follow up on your question, because so you're in the sort of protectionist, and obviously we're slightly different ages. We also live in different parts of the country. I would imagine that our voting record in public politics, regardless, is probably cut differently as well. Where does the end come? I mean, you've been vaccinated. Do you think that masks remain, as an example, on planes go forward? Because I'm kind of thinking they do. As much as I hate it, I kind of think planes are going to mandate masks for a much longer period of time than the pandemic. And I'm curious where you fall on some of these issues.
Well, in the question of the mask, it's sort of a cost benefit thing, which is it's annoying to wear the mask, but it's not that big a deal. As opposed to, say, let's close your store for 6 months or your restaurant. That has a big cost to it. So I think as we get closer and closer to herd immunity, and we're moving that
pretty close now, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then you reach a certain point where you say, look, I've been vaccinated, and so I don't think people need to worry about it. And I suspect, a year from now, in mostly industrialized countries, we'll see that life is pretty much back to normal. I don't know if you would want to go into a bar with a bunch of strangers and, spend 6 hours without ventilation. But I think you may also see there's a lot more ventilation. I know people who sell ventilation are probably raking it in now. And I don't think that, it's a conspiracy, that the pandemic is a conspiracy by the ventilation business.
So I like this, because again, I think this is to the point. Long form communication, and people on different viewpoints don't need to throw tomatoes. They can actually ask questions. And so the one that is striking to me is, I remember, because it was about a year ago, that it was 14 days to flatten the curve, because the issue was we were very concerned about hospitals. Now there's a ton of capacity. We know that 78% of the people who were hospitalized over the course of this in the United States were overweight or obese. We know that 80.7% of the people who died were over 65. And so, to your bar thing, if a 30-year-old college kid, 20-year-old college kid is hanging out with their 100 buddies, the likelihood of them going to the hospital is virtually zero. And when everyone has had the opportunity to have the vaccine, which either A, makes it less severe so you don't have to go, or B, in the best case, makes it not contagious, we've solved the original goal, which was don't fill the hospitals. It feels like there's been a major scope creep in terms of, well, we can't get anyone sick because, if it's not coronavirus, it's going to be flu or colds or SARS or Ebola or something, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you travel much in Asia. In Japan, for example, I go there from time to time, and they have a culture of, you have a cough, you wear a mask so you don't give it to other people.
I
But
like
not
that. That
everybody.
makes total sense.
Right. And people don't wear masks during the flu season. So I do think we'll get to that point. And yeah, I mean, I have a 22-year-old daughter, and I'm a lot less worried about her. She's very careful. But I'm a lot less worried about her because, as you say, the younger people don't seem to be as vulnerable. But if it's a question of her saying, I think I won't go to a bar until I've been vaccinated. Okay, that doesn't. I don't feel like that's a big. I don't want her hanging out in bars anyway. That's something for her old man.
Right.
That's not a huge sacrifice. So it's always cost benefit. You compare sort of Brazil, where the president just said, "Yeah, we're not going to do anything," and they had huge problems, versus some of the other countries and parts of this country where there were big lockdowns. And you say, okay, we should be having a better sense of what needs to be done. And as you're suggesting, and I suspect it's true, but people shouldn't take my advice on this. The lockdowns have been overdone. Mask wearing is low cost and seems to be effective. So we should move in that direction, I think.
Yeah, the last thing, and then we'll do one more question because I was curious your views on our new President Biden. But we'll get there. So what I love is the way you characterize it, and everything we've talked about EVs. There's a cost benefit analysis, and you are totally right. The mask wearing is actually a very low cost way to get back to life. The one that I always was frustrated about, and I wrote about last April, even though people might not have read it and find this surprising, I was in favor of masks if and only if they lifted 100% of the restrictions. Because my view was, okay, it's a low cost thing, but so now we're doing it. So let businesses make the choice, because we've all figured out how to do this 6 foot, 3 foot, 1 foot, and we layered on masks with social distancing, with lockdowns, with shutdowns, with capacity limits. And it's like, I mean, we might as well have added, you had to carry a bottle of Windex and spray the air 3 times just because that's low cost too. And I just wish there'd been more critical thought. And I blame President Trump on this, because I don't think he was wrong. I think he was incredibly unlikable in the way that he said things. And if he had a little bit more of the guy that was in the medical center post coronavirus, when he was thanking people for their support, and a little bit more balanced and measured and less narcissistic, I think he could have convinced people to be more measured, which is what he was advocating for. But people dug in because they're like, I can't listen to this guy because I hate him so much. And it created this tension.
Right. And you had half the people saying, I'm not wearing a mask for politics, and half saying we should have a complete lockdown because Trump says don't do it. There were a number of times when Trump said things that were not unreasonable, and he was attacked simply because he was Trump. And I agree with that. And it's unfortunate. Again, it's you have to try to judge the facts, not the person. And we are human. We are prone to error and bias. Einstein himself said everybody's stupid about something. So what chance do we have of not being stupid about things? That's why I'm more inclined to wear a mask if Dr. Fauci tells me than if Governor DeSantis in Florida tells me. And I have, my favorite, I think, the example I cite as quote unquote a good politician, Governor Hickenlooper. People said, what do we do about fracking? And he looked and he said, well, we have to regulate it because, things have to be regulated, but I'm not opposed to it. Even Jerry Brown, who was Governor Moonbeam when I was a boy, we called him Governor Moon. He said, yeah, okay, the fracking's not wrong. And yet you have all these people who are opposed to it. And if you ask them why, And I've written several times, they go, well, there's benzene. I go, there's benzene in the streets of Manhattan.
Yeah.
Benzene's pretty much everywhere. It's like the old days. People said, oh my God, nuclear plants have radiation. We can't have radiation.
Oh yeah. Do you use your microwave or no? Not so
You ever
much.
look at the sun? You live in
Yeah.
Colorado, you get more exposure because you're higher up. I mean, there's the planet's radioactive. People are radioactive. So you can't have zero radiation any more than you can have zero emissions. And you should just say, what's the cost benefit? Should we? I believe my family still has some mineral rights to coal deposits, but I'm not in favor of burning coal. The stuff is filthy. I am in favor of burning natural gas. It's an awful lot cleaner, and I'd still make a little bit of money. Not much these days, but think about what is the real cost and benefit, and don't rely on, frankly, people who wave placards or politicians, or don't automatically believe a politician or automatically disbelieve a politician.
So it's funny because I think the Trump example is, and I think you're right. I mean, and I would add to the politics. I talk to my mother who's in Canada about this all the time, and she goes, I don't understand why mask wearing is political. And I said, well, in part, some people probably it was like, I'm not going to do it because my guy said. But I also think that the difference between Republicans is very much a personal responsibility, individual success, Ayn Rand philosophy. And the philosophy of Democrats is collective good, safety net, society. Again, that's broad strokes, but even just to the core of why you are affiliated with a party, there's a lot of things that the coronavirus sort of like brought to bear. So the Trump situation to me was very much I dig in side versus side. What I find very interesting about President Biden in his first roughly 65 days is the kid gloves with which the media are treating him. And you see these clips of things that if Trump had said them, I mean, I can't even imagine. The fact that the shooter in Colorado, I mean, was a Syrian refugee, and we bombed Syria 30 days ago, and that's not allowed to be talked about because that would be Islamophobic. And yet when people thought it was a white male, it was clearly an act of racism and white supremacy. And it seems like there's like none of the rules that applied under Trump are being applied to the President Biden to have a critical conversation about his mental health, about some of the policies that are putting forward, about the fact that we have the migrant caravan. We had a migrant caravan under Trump. Somehow, I'm curious how you think that this goes for the next 100 days. And does he finish his term?
I suspect he'll finish his term. I think, the media usually will turn on whoever's in power over time because they feel that their role is to be critical. There's certainly, not all the media is biased. Well, humans tend to be biased. People have a hard time believing that. I've known scientists who go, but I'm a scientist. So
you're always biased. So who funds your research? That's the outcome you're going to get. Just there you go.
No. I saw a guy and he said, I run a multidisciplinary laboratory, therefore I'm unbiased. So when I tell you that my research is the best is the most important research, you can believe that. And it's like, do you listen to yourself? It's hard. I mean, these days, social media allows people to have more of a voice than when I was a boy, and it was okay. You write a letter to the newspaper, and there's a 1 in 10,000 chance it gets published. And we used to, when I lived in Cambridge, at Harvard Square every Saturday, there was a guy who had a little portable megaphone, and he was some kind of communist, like a Trotskyite or something. He'd stand and rant Marxist stuff while people just ignored him. Well, now you can do it on Twitter. You can be heard, so people can say, as you do, well, this guy was a Syrian refugee, even if the media is generally ignoring it. But it's generally a problem, and it is difficult. And I'm not. There's not a real perfect answer, except you have to try to keep making things better. That is, to say, okay, I can't make the media unbiased, but I can try to push them to be less biased. And that's the best you can do. And, especially if you have a politician who's a nitwit, well, okay, I shouldn't say. So here in Massachusetts, We actually have a Republican governor who's very good. He's what we used to call moderate Republican. The two senators we have are extremely liberal, and I think that neither of them would ever listen to anything I said about energy, frankly. And they have all their own opinions. That's a problem, and it's hard to cure, especially. I know a lot of people who were convinced that the oil price would be $250 by now. One guy wrote a book and said you're not going to be able to have to get fresh salmon anymore because it'll be too expensive to transport, things like that. And some of these people are still out there promoting the same thing, having been wrong for decades and decades. Most famously, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb and said the planet would have mass starvation by 1980. And his work is garbage. I mean, I've read a bunch of his stuff, and he says, here's a fact, and and therefore I predict. You're like, how do you connect the two?
Right.
And when people say, somebody asked and said, oh, you said that there was a 50-50 chance that by the year 2000, England wouldn't exist. And if it did, it would be a desolate place full of starving people. And he said, well, they've had problems. And the reporter didn't say they've had problems. That's not, But he's won award after award, including MacArthur Genius Grant and so forth. And you sort of go, you can't find anything that he's written that's of any value. But he's forgive the expression, he's a darling of the political left.
So I guess the hope for those who are currently, because I would say, again, we talked about the hatred that existed between Republicans and Democrats, I think, over the Trump terms. I don't think that that's the wrong thing. What I'm seeing now and what I'm more fearful of is the apathy, because I see the way President Biden is treated in these press conferences, and that they literally won't let anyone ask questions. And the questions are like, Mr. President, how was your sandwich today at lunch? Was it tasty? And he's like, oh, I think it was turkey. It could have been ham or vegetarian. I'm not totally sure, but thank you for asking that wonderfully challenging question. But what I think I'm feeling is a level of apathy where there's a little bit of a Randian shrug that some people on the right, certainly the moderates, are saying, I don't want really any part of this. And so I'm gonna spend my time pulling away. And I wrote about this yesterday. The fact that the president put forward his cabinet and everyone had to be, well, this is the first openly gay, transport minister, and this is the first indigenous, and so it never had anything to do with merit or qualifications, though they may truly be the best people for the job. I don't know. But we're not focusing on it at all. And we've moved away from when they talk about the schools, well, standardized testing is racist and math is racist. And we can't do any of these things because it's making me want to hang out with people more like me, as opposed to want to be inclusive of people less like me. If anything, it's changed my views where I've withdrawn from the world more in the last year, which seems counter, because when I grew up, I didn't even see color or race or sex, or I didn't care. I see it now more today than before. And if that's happening to me, I'm deeply concerned about what the fallback from that will be. You're in a different state. Do you see that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a degree of cancel culture. I mean, Socrates was told to drink hemlock because they thought he was corrupting the youth with his wacky ideas. In fact, I don't remember what any of his ideas were, but
right.
So, but I think the vitriol has increased, and it's partly sort of the tribalization, and it's not phenomenally new. If you go back to this pre-Civil War era, you saw the things people were saying about Lincoln, for example, were just crazy, instead of sitting down and having honest debates. And after World War II, especially foreign policy, there was a lot more, let's work together, let's have consensus. But I think now it's become a question of much more, yes, we're good, you're evil. And I know some people suggest, oh, if we had congressional districts that were drawn by impartial, quote unquote, impartial judges, you'd have less tendency towards extremism on left and right in the primaries, which I think that is part of the problem. Watching a couple of young, very progressive people get elected to Congress against old established people. But it's also that, I think the whole Tea Party movement and the Trump movement, a lot of people are saying, we're fed up with business as usual, the way things are being done. Trump didn't fix much of that. And I'm not sure if Biden's going to fix any of it. But again, you go into a congressional hearing or a debate somewhere and you hear somebody spout nonsense for 20 minutes while everybody nods sagely. I did that. I saw a guy talking about oil in Washington, and there were 5 of us who were in the oil business, as it were, in the back set going, this guy's an idiot. But all the military and diplomatic people going, wow, really? We had no idea. Famous story was Vannevar Bush, who was running the radar program in World War II. The Congress called him in and said, can you explain where all this money's going? So he started writing equations on a blackboard. And I said, never mind, we trust you. And there is a lot of that, just again, like the superficial nature where if you're an expensive consultant with a flashy, with a $500, I guess it's $1,000 suit now, people will listen to you. Whereas, I had somebody say to me once, we believe you, but when we go to the regulator, they're going to say, why did you get this guy from Boston instead of this big consulting firm, which says the opposite?
Yeah.
And that's a longstanding problem.
Well, Michael, tell listeners where they can follow you and what they can expect from you next. What's the latest piece that we'll be seeing?
I'm going to write some about cost of fracking for Forbes.com. You can find me on there. That's where most of my stuff appears. I Twitter as Laughing Economist, spelled Laffng Economist. And I do a certain amount of poetry on Twitter. And if you go to eprinc.org, you can find some of my research reports on, for example, peak oil demand, yay or nay. I say nay, big surprise. So, and those are the best places to find me.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I sure appreciate the conversation. I wish you the best. Now that you're vaccinated, you can get out back in the world and go dominate some bars and go have some good beer. And I hope everything goes well, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
Thanks, and the best to you, David. Take care.
Thanks. Hot Take Nation, thank you for listening. Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.